Captain Grant Mercer had been flying for Atlantic Crown Airlines for 16 years. 16 years without a single incident, without a single formal complaint, without a single stain on his record. And in all those years, he'd never seen anything as out of place as what stood before him right now. A man in a faded black hoodie, no watch, no briefcase, no carry-on worth more than $20, and beside him, a teenage girl in a ripped denim jacket with a backpack that looked like it'd survived 3 semesters too many. No first-class energy, no business-class composure. Nothing that said these two belonged anywhere near his aircraft. At least that's what he thought. "Sir," Mercer said, extending his arm across the boarding stairs like a velvet rope made of bone. "This flight's been adjusted. You'll need to wait for the next one." The girl looked up at the captain with wide eyes, the kind of eyes that hadn't yet learned to hide what they felt. But the man didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He looked at Mercer the way a wolf looks at a fence. Not with fear, not with frustration, with patience. The kind of patience that comes from knowing the fence won't be there long. What Captain Mercer didn't know, what he couldn't have known standing there in his pressed uniform with 4 stripes on his sleeve and 16 years of unchecked authority behind his smile, was that the man in the hoodie owned the airline. Every plane, every route, every contract with his signature buried 3 layers deep in a holding company that most board members couldn't even name. Asher Kane, 36 years old, 6'2", jaw like a locked door, hands that had signed death warrants and bedtime permission slips in the same week. The most dangerous man on the eastern seaboard didn't fly first class today because his 15-year-old daughter, Phoebe, had dared him to ride coach. "Come on, Dad," she'd said that morning, grinning over her cereal bowl in the penthouse kitchen overlooking Central Park. "You always say you built this airline for real people, so be a real person, just once." And Asher, who hadn't lost an argument to anyone in 15 years except this girl, had put on the hoodie, left the Rolex on the nightstand, and followed her out the door. Now here they stood, refused boarding on their own aircraft by a captain who couldn't see past the clothes. Phoebe tugged her father's sleeve. "Dad, just call Uncle Jonah. He'll fix it in 2 seconds." Asher shook his head slowly. No. One word. No explanation. Because Asher Kane had learned something a long time ago. Something his late wife Faye had whispered to him from a hospital bed, 6 days before she closed her eyes for the last time. Don't ever let them see you angry. Asher, the moment you're calmest is the moment you're strongest. He stepped back from the stairs, pulled out a phone that looked older than it should have for a man worth what he was worth, and dialed a single number. When the voice on the other end picked up, Asher said only this: "Jonah, I need the full disciplinary file on Captain Grant Mercer, and the complete operations audit for Atlantic Crown, last 6 months. Every transaction, every signature. Now." He hung up. Phoebe watched him with that look she had, the one that was half her mother's grace and half her father's storm. She'd seen that expression before. The last time she'd seen it, a man had disappeared from New York within 48 hours, and no one had asked where he went. But what Asher Kane didn't know yet, what neither he nor Phoebe could have possibly known standing in that terminal, with the October sun cutting through the glass walls of JFK like a blade, was that on board the plane they'd just been thrown off of, in seat 24C, economy class, a woman was sitting alone with a bruise hidden beneath a scarf, hands trembling around a backpack that held everything she owned in this world. A woman who was running from a man who'd broken her in ways that don't show on X-rays. A woman who, once upon a time, had read bedtime stories to Phoebe Kane every Tuesday and Thursday for 6 months before vanishing without a word, and whose name, when Phoebe finally saw her face through the cabin window, would change everything. Not just the flight, not just the day. Everything. If you're already hooked and you want to see what happens when the most dangerous man in America meets the one woman who doesn't know who he is, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs a reason to stay up tonight. And subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to that October morning at JFK, where Asher Kane had just been denied boarding on his own plane. And somewhere inside that aircraft, a woman named Nell Fleming was about to be found by the last people she ever expected to see again. Asher Kane wasn't in a hurry. He stopped in the middle of the terminal, one hand resting on Phoebe's shoulder, the other still holding the phone he had just used to call Jonah. Phoebe looked up at her father, her eyes still red with anger, her lips pressed tight in the way Faye always did when she was trying not to say something that would make everything worse. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" she asked. Asher didn't answer. He looked toward the counter at gate 14B, where a dark-haired ground agent with her hair neatly tied back was typing at a keyboard, her name tag reading Diana, about 25 years old, the kind of person who followed procedure not because she was afraid of getting fired, but because she truly believed procedure existed for a reason. Asher walked toward the counter with the pace of a man taking a morning stroll through a park. Phoebe followed behind him, her backpack swaying lightly on her shoulder. "Good morning," Asher said in the most ordinary voice he could manage, as if he weren't the man who had just been thrown off the boarding stairs of his own plane by its captain. "Flight AC 47 to Los Angeles. I have 2 confirmed seats." The system scanned our boarding passes green, but the captain said the flight had been adjusted and refused to let us board. "Could you check that for me?" Diana looked up, looked at the hoodie, looked at Phoebe, then back at the screen. She entered the flight number into the system. A few seconds passed. "Sir," Diana said slowly, her eyes still fixed on the monitor. "Seats 23A and 23B are still assigned to the name Kane. There are no notes showing any changes in the system. There is no recorded denial of boarding entered into the file." She looked up at Asher with the expression of someone who had just discovered that something was wrong, but wasn't yet ready to say it outright. Under federal regulations, the captain does have the authority to deny a passenger boarding for safety reasons, but that reason has to be entered into the system before the aircraft leaves the gate. At this moment, there is no record of any such entry. "Meaning?" Asher asked, even though he already knew the answer. "Meaning you have every legal right to board this flight." Diana stood up. She looked toward the jet bridge connected to the aircraft, then back at Asher. A small decision passed behind her dark eyes, the kind of decision most people would choose to handle in the safer way, rather than the right one. But Diana wasn't most people. "Let me reissue your boarding passes. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." She rescanned both passes and handed them to Asher with both hands. Phoebe took hers with the half-smile only a 15-year-old could manage, half victory, half contempt for adults who didn't even know the rules of their own world. They stepped into the jet bridge. Their footsteps echoed softly across the metal floor. The light inside was narrow and artificial, the kind of light that made everything feel more temporary than it really was. And at the far end of the bridge, just outside the aircraft door, Grant Mercer was standing there. He didn't block their path this time. He stood off to one side, a radio in his hand, his face still wearing the professional expression that 16 years in the cockpit had carved into him, but his eyes gave him away. Asher walked past him, the 2 men separated by less than half a meter, and Asher didn't look at him, didn't say a word, didn't change his pace, as if Mercer were part of the wall, as if he didn't exist at all. And in that exact moment, the moment Asher Kane walked past the captain as though he were nothing but air, Grant Mercer felt something strange rise from the pit of his stomach for the first time in 16 years. It wasn't anger. It wasn't shame. It was something far worse. Something people who are used to holding power rarely recognize until it's already too late. It was the feeling that he had just made a mistake whose consequences he still couldn't see. Inside the cabin, the familiar smell of fresh plastic, reheated coffee, and cheap perfume blended into that distinct kind of air only economy class ever seemed to have. Asher walked behind Phoebe down the narrow aisle, his shoulders nearly brushing the overhead bins. Around them rose the ordinary sounds of a flight that hadn't taken off yet. The snap of suitcase latches opening, the voices of children arguing over the window seat, the too loud voice of a man talking on the phone about a meeting that clearly no one on the other end cared about. Phoebe walked ahead, her backpack swaying on her shoulder, her eyes counting the row numbers. 21, 22, 23. She turned into her row, and at that exact moment her eyes swept across row 24. Phoebe stopped. Not the kind of stop that comes when someone remembers they forgot something, or because someone is blocking the way. It was the kind of stop the body makes when the brain recognizes something before consciousness can catch up. Every movement in her seemed to freeze at once. Her feet, her hands, her breathing. Even the backpack stopped swaying as if it too were staring. In seat 24C, by the window, a woman sat curled in on herself as if trying to take up as little space as possible. Brown hair fell loose across half her face. A gray scarf was wrapped around her neck even though the cabin wasn't cold at all. Both of her hands clutched the backpack in her lap the way people hold on to the last thing they still own. "Miss Nell?" Phoebe's voice broke through the cabin noise. Not loud, but sharp enough that several people in nearby rows turned their heads. The woman didn't react right away. 1 second passed, then 2. Then she slowly lifted her head, as if even that movement cost the last of her strength. And when her hair fell back from her face, the gray scarf slipped 3 inches down her shoulder. 3 inches was enough to reveal a dark bruise running from her collarbone almost to her ear. Not the kind of bruise someone gets from bumping into the edge of a table, but a bruise shaped like fingers, the kind of mark no explanation can turn into an accident. Nell Fleming's eyes met Phoebe Kane's eyes, and in that moment, in row 24 of economy class on flight AC-47 from New York to Los Angeles, time froze in the way only the most impossible reunions can make it freeze. Nell's eyes widened and then filled with tears in less than a breath. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, as if the girl's name was caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. Phoebe didn't say another word. She stepped into row 24, set her backpack on the floor, and sat down in the middle seat right beside Nell as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if 6 months of silence and one farewell text that had never been explained had never happened at all. When Phoebe sat down, her right wrist passed through Nell's line of sight. Around it, delicate and faded now, but still intact, was a woven bracelet made of embroidery thread, 3 strands twisted together, blue, white, and pale yellow. Nell stared at the bracelet. Her hand flew up to cover her mouth, but not fast enough to hide the sob that escaped. She had made that bracelet for Phoebe during their last lesson. The lesson she hadn't known would be the last. The lesson after which she had come home to find Drew waiting at the door with only one question. Who gave you permission to go? Asher stood in the aisle, not yet seated. He watched the entire scene unfold in silence. His daughter had just given up her own seat to sit beside a woman he had never met. A woman with bruises on her neck and the eyes of someone who had been hit so often she had forgotten how to look at another person without fear. Asher knew those eyes. He had seen them every day in the mirror through the years from 10 to 14, before his mother died, and he swore that he would never let anyone look at the world with those eyes again. He sat down in seat 23C, across the aisle, 1 row ahead at an angle. From there he could see Phoebe, see Nell, see Phoebe's arm already looped through Nell's elbow as if she were afraid the woman might disappear again. Asher slipped a hand into the inner pocket of his hoodie and pulled out something no one on this flight would have expected a man dressed like him to own. A silver pocket watch, its glass face slightly clouded by time. The cover engraved with the tiny letters F.K. in the lower corner. Faye Kane. His wife had given him that watch on the day Phoebe was born, not because he needed to know the time, but because she wanted him to have something to hold in his hand whenever he had to make a decision without her beside him. Asher opened the cover, heard the small familiar click, looked at the face, then looked across the aisle where his daughter was holding the hand of a woman whose name he didn't know, but who had somehow made his daughter cry for a week when she vanished. He didn't know the story yet, didn't know the name, didn't know who had left those bruises behind, but Asher Kane had lived long enough in the world he lived in to know that finger-shaped bruises on a woman's neck are never the final chapter. There is always a next chapter, and the next chapter is usually worse. He snapped the pocket watch shut, slid it back into his pocket, and for the first time since stepping onto this plane, Asher Kane wasn't thinking about Grant Mercer or Atlantic Crown or whatever Jonah was about to send him. He was thinking about the gray scarf around the woman in seat 24C, and about the man who had made her wrap it around her neck in the middle of October. The plane pulled away from the gate right on time. The steady thrum of the engines rose beneath the cabin floor like the heartbeat of something larger than everyone inside it. Phoebe was still sitting in row 24, her arm hooked through Nell's elbow, saying nothing, simply being there. Nell didn't speak either. She sat motionless, staring down at her hands resting on her backpack, her fingers tightening now and then releasing again, as if she were practicing a new habit, the habit of holding on not because she was afraid, but because someone was sitting beside her. The plane lifted off. The familiar pressure settled against the chest as the wheels left the ground, and New York slowly shrank beneath the wing, the buildings turning into matchboxes, the Hudson becoming a silver line, and then all of it disappearing behind October clouds thick as cotton. 15 minutes after the seatbelt sign went dark, a face appeared in the narrow gap between 2 seats in row 23. A little boy, about 6 years old, with messy brown curls, flushed cheeks, and wide round eyes, peered toward the back with the solemn look of someone carrying out a reconnaissance mission. He looked straight at Phoebe. "Miss," he said in a whisper so loud half the cabin could hear it. Do you know if there are dinosaurs in LA? Phoebe blinked. What? Dinosaurs, the boy repeated with the patience of someone explaining the obvious to a less informed person. At the museum near the airport. My mom says they're fake bones, but I don't believe her. Why would people put fake bones in a museum? That doesn't make sense. His mother, a blonde woman seated beside him, leaned out with the weary expression of someone who had probably apologized for her child about 12 times since leaving the house that morning. Tommy, turn around and sit down, honey. Don't bother people. Tommy didn't turn around. Tommy had more important work to do. How old are you? He asked Phoebe. 15. Oh. Tommy processed that information with complete seriousness. You're really old. Do you like dinosaurs? I did when I was little. When was little? When I was your age. Tommy wrinkled his nose. So that was a very long time ago. And Phoebe laughed. Not the polite smile she used when she met her father's business associates. Not the half-amused, half-contemptuous smile she gave the adult world. It was a real laugh, rising from someplace deep inside her that she had shut away a long time ago. Brief, but clear enough that Asher heard it from across the aisle. He looked up from his phone screen, looked over, and what he saw made him forget the line of text from Jonah glowing on the display. His daughter was laughing. Phoebe Kane, 15 years old. The child who hadn't truly laughed since the day her tutor vanished without a word. The child who had built a wall of books and silence around herself for the past 6 months was laughing because a 6-year-old boy had asked her about dinosaurs. Asher didn't laugh with her. He only watched, and somewhere behind the cold steel eyes of the most dangerous man on the East Coast, something shifted, only slightly. So slightly, it was almost too little to notice. Tommy turned to Nell. Are you going to LA too? Are you sad? Your eyes are red. This time, Tommy's mother was genuinely horrified. Thomas James, get back in your seat right now. Tommy sighed like a 70-year-old husband forbidden by his wife to speak to anyone, then retreated toward his own row, though not before glancing back at Phoebe one last time. Don't forget to go see the dinosaurs. Those bones are real. Phoebe nodded. I won't. Tommy disappeared behind the seatbacks. The soft sound of his mother's scolding drifted out, and then faded. The cabin settled back into its usual rhythm. And it was right then, just as the quiet had barely returned, that Nell bent down to open her backpack and take out a bottle of water. She pulled the zipper open, slid her hand inside, and when she drew the water bottle out, something else slipped free with it, slid from the mouth of the bag, and fell to the cabin floor with a soft tap that, in the stillness of the passenger cabin, sounded as clear as a knock at the door. A small book. The hardcover was torn along the spine, the corners curled from having been folded too many times. The picture on the front almost faded away, but still recognizable. A green tree and a little boy sitting beneath it. The Giving Tree. Phoebe looked down at the book on the floor. Her hand slipped from Nell's elbow, reached down, and picked it up. She turned it slowly in her hands, as if she were holding something even more fragile than paper. Then she spoke, her voice so quiet Nell had to lean closer to hear it clearly. The book you used to read to me. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. 4 words carrying the weight of 6 months of reading, every Tuesday and Thursday night. 6 months in which a 15-year-old girl without a mother had found in her tutor something her father's money couldn't buy and his power couldn't command into existence. Nell looked at the book in Phoebe's hands. Her eyes shimmered, but the tears didn't fall, as if she had learned how to keep tears balanced at the very edge of her lashes without letting them spill over, a skill no one should ever have to learn. You still remember, Nell whispered. I never forgot, Phoebe answered. Silence followed. Not the comfortable kind. The heavy silence of things still unspoken, of the question, why did you disappear, hanging between them like a wire, neither of them dared touch. Asher watched from seat 23C. He couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, but he could read the scene. The old book, the wet eyes on both of them, the way Phoebe held that worn book as if she were holding proof of something that had been stolen. He still didn't understand the whole picture. He didn't know what this woman had taught his daughter, who had made her disappear, or what she had been running from. But Asher Kane wasn't a man who needed the entire picture before he began to act. He only needed enough pieces to know whether the picture was worth his attention. And when he saw his daughter holding that torn book in her hands, with the kind of eyes he hadn't seen since Faye was still alive, Asher knew the answer. Asher's phone vibrated twice in quick succession. Jonah Webb wasn't the kind of man who sent a message unless there was something worth sending, and he certainly wasn't the kind to send 2 in a row unless whatever was inside was serious enough to make a man normally calm as stone type faster than usual. Asher opened the first message. Attachment. Captain Grant Mercer's disciplinary file. 37 pages. He read quickly in the way 20 years of reading contracts, financial reports, and witness statements had trained him to read, not word by word, but scanning for the places the person who drafted the document hadn't wanted anyone to notice. 16 years of service. A clean flight record. No technical incidents, no accidents, no safety violations. Up to that point, Mercer looked exactly like what the 4 stripes on his sleeve advertised, but on page 23, under administrative complaints, Asher found the thing those 16 clean years had hidden. 4 formal complaints in 3 years. 4 different passengers. 4 different flights. The same accusation every time. Discrimination during boarding. Passenger 1. A Middle Eastern woman asked to present additional identification that no other passenger had been required to show. Passenger 2. A young black man in athletic clothes denied boarding for what was called a seat adjustment that the system never recorded. Passenger 3. A large family carrying bulky luggage moved to a later flight even though seats were still empty. Passenger 4. A disabled veteran in a wheelchair held at the gate for safety reasons that no one could ever explain clearly. 4 complaints. 4 times passengers wrote official letters to Atlantic Crown Airlines headquarters. And 4 times those complaints reached the same desk and disappeared. Ray Holt's desk, Director of Operations, based at the Los Angeles Operations Center. Holt had signed all 4 decisions to archive the files without action. 4 times. Same pen. Same signature. Asher scrolled to the bottom of the document, where Jonah had marked a line with 3 exclamation points, something Jonah had never done in 6 years of working for him. The line read, Mercer received special performance bonuses in 3 of the last 4 years, all approved by Holt. Asher closed the first file and opened the second. Financials. If Mercer's disciplinary file had been the smell of smoke, the second file was the fire. Pinnacle Freight LLC, a company registered in Delaware, the state where you can open a company faster than a bank account and hide your identity more easily than changing your name on social media. Pinnacle Freight had no real office, no employees, no website, no sign that it existed in the real world at all, beyond a mailbox in Wilmington, and a bank account at a satellite branch of a community bank Asher had never even heard of. Over the last 18 months, 8 transfers had been made from the operating account of Atlantic Crown Airlines Los Angeles Center to Pinnacle Freight LLC. 8 times. Total amount, $4,200,000. Every one of them listed as preventive maintenance costs and ground logistics services. Every one of them carrying a single signature, Ray Holt. Asher read the numbers twice, not because he didn't understand them, but because he wanted to make sure the anger rising in his chest wasn't making him read them wrong. $4.2 million from his company's account into an empty shell in Delaware, signed by a man he was paying. 18 months. Exactly 18 months. The same stretch of time that matched perfectly with the last time Asher had personally reviewed the aviation division, instead of leaving it to executive management to run on its own. The phone vibrated a 3rd time. Another message from Jonah, shorter than the first 2, but heavier than both. Holt has called an emergency board meeting tomorrow at 9 in the morning at the LA office. Agenda. Approve the sale of 35% of Atlantic Crown stock to an investment fund called Meridian Partners. I can't find this fund in any database. No SEC filings, no trading history, nothing. Asher set the phone down on the tray table, looked out the window. 35,000 feet below, America stretched out like a map, flat, peaceful, utterly unaware of what was moving through the mind of the man in seat 23C. The picture was clear enough now. Holt was pulling money out of Atlantic Crown through a ghost company, pouring it into a ghost investment fund, then using that same fund to circle back and buy shares of Atlantic Crown. Asher Kane's money was being used to buy Asher Kane's company out from under him, and tomorrow's meeting would legalize the whole circle before anyone realized what had happened. That wasn't ordinary corruption. It was the kind of corruption built like architecture, with blueprints, with a schedule, the kind carried out by someone who had spent months calculating every step with the confidence of a man who believed the owner would never bother to look down. Asher picked up the phone and typed a single message to Jonah. Received. Don't do anything until I call. Then he turned off the screen, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and looked across the aisle to row 24, where his daughter was sitting beside a woman with bruises on her neck and a torn hardback book resting in her lap. Two problems. Two completely different worlds. One was money, one was blood, and Asher Kane, sitting in an old hoodie on the economy flight of his own airline, knew that before the night was over, he would have to deal with both. 40 minutes after takeoff, something changed. Not loudly, not suddenly, not in the way that makes passengers lift their heads from their phone screens. It was the kind of change only someone who had spent a lifetime listening for the things other people ignored would notice. The engine noise shifted in pitch, only slightly, almost too little to matter, as if someone had turned a volume knob down half a mark and then turned it back up again, but not to exactly the same place. Asher heard it. He wasn't a pilot, but he owned 14 aircraft and had sat in cockpits often enough to know what a Boeing 737 sounds like at cruising altitude when everything is normal. And this sound wasn't normal. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a course change. He looked out the window. The angle of the sunlight falling across the wing had changed, tilted farther than it had a few minutes earlier, drifting north instead of holding the straight southwest line of a standard JFK to LAX route. The plane was turning. No one had announced it. And right then, Vera Price walked down the aisle. Asher had noticed her before takeoff, not because she was beautiful or because she had done anything wrong, but because of her shoulders. Flight attendants are trained to wear a smile on their face and lightness on their shoulders, no matter how fierce the storm inside them may be. Vera had the correct smile, but her shoulders did not. They were tense, raised about 2 centimeters higher than normal, the kind of tension carried by someone who knows something the passengers do not know and is trying to bear it alone. She moved quickly toward the front of the cabin and disappeared behind the curtain dividing the cockpit from the passenger cabin. 2 minutes later, she came back. The smile was exactly the same. The shoulders were exactly the same. Then the intercom clicked on. Captain Mercer's voice poured into the cabin with the smooth confidence of a man who had lied often enough to turn it into a professional skill. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are going to have a slight route adjustment due to weather conditions ahead. There is nothing to worry about. Our arrival in Los Angeles will be delayed by about 20 minutes. Thank you for your understanding. The reaction in the cabin unfolded exactly the way it does on every other flight. A few sighs. One person muttering about a connection. Tommy in row 23 turned to his mother and asked, "How long is 20 minutes?" And his mother answered, "About 2 episodes of Bluey." Tommy nodded as if that were the only unit of time that had any meaning in the world. Asher did not sigh. Asher opened the aviation weather app on his phone, the app every pilot and airline owner has, showing a real-time radar map across the entire airspace of the United States. He looked at the route from New York to Los Angeles. Green. Completely green. No storm clouds, no turbulence zone, no weather advisory on any part of the journey. The sky from the East Coast to the West Coast was as clear as freshly cleaned glass. Grant Mercer had just lied to 162 passengers. Asher closed the app, set the phone face down on the tray table, and waited. He didn't know what he was waiting for until it happened. Vera Price passed by a second time, this time moving from the rear of the cabin toward the front. When she came, even with row 23, her steps slowed by half a beat, almost too little to notice unless you were watching. And Asher was watching. Something light dropped onto his tray table, a folded piece of paper, folded into quarters, no bigger than half a hand. The kind of paper torn from a flight attendant's drink order pad. Vera didn't look at him, didn't stop walking, didn't change her expression. She kept moving toward the front of the cabin, as though nothing had just happened. Asher waited 10 seconds, counted silently in his head, then he picked up the paper and unfolded it beneath the edge of the tray table, where no one could see from any angle in the cabin. Handwriting, small, quick, the letters trembling slightly at the end of each word, as if the person writing had been trying to finish before her courage had time to leave. Mercer got a call from R. Holt before takeoff. They know there's an inspector on this flight. They don't know it's you. Asher read the 4 lines twice, folded the paper back along the original creases, and slipped it into the inner pocket of his hoodie, right beside the silver watch engraved with the letters F.K. Then he leaned back in his seat, his eyes lifting to the cabin ceiling where the reading light cast a small circle across his lap, like a miniature interrogation lamp. Everything had just shifted. Mercer had not blocked him at the stairs this morning on his own initiative. Mercer had taken orders from Holt. Holt knew there was an inspector on the flight, which meant someone inside the system had leaked information to Holt, which meant Holt had people on the inside, which meant this network was not just one greedy operations director signing a few checks. It had architecture. It had people guarding the doors. It had watchers. And Holt had ordered Mercer to stop the inspector from boarding the plane to make sure no one reached Los Angeles in time for tomorrow's board meeting. But Holt had made one mistake. Only one, but a fatal one. Holt thought the inspector was an internal audit employee, some low-ranking person insignificant enough for a captain with 4 stripes to throw off the boarding stairs with a single lie. Holt didn't know that today's inspector was wearing a black hoodie and traveling with a 15-year-old girl who liked dinosaurs. Holt didn't know that today's inspector owned every aircraft Holt was trying to sell. And Holt didn't know that this inspector, at this very moment, was sitting in seat 23C in economy class, with a piece of paper in his pocket, and a list growing longer in his mind. A list of the people who would pay when this plane landed. Asher looked across the aisle. Phoebe had fallen asleep, her head resting on Nell's shoulder. Nell was still awake, her eyes turned toward the window where white clouds drifted past like torn cotton, and her right hand was absently smoothing Phoebe's hair in the slow rhythm only someone who had once cared for this child would know. And Vera Price, at the end of the aisle, was pouring orange juice for an elderly passenger, her shoulders still tense, but her eyes holding something different now, slightly lighter, as if leaving that note behind had lifted a small part of the weight she had been carrying for far too long. Nell drifted off to sleep about an hour after the plane had settled at cruising altitude. It wasn't the sleep of someone at ease. It was the sleep of a body that had endured for so long it simply shut itself down, without asking permission from the mind. Her head tilted toward the window, her hair falling over half her face, and even in sleep her face was still tense. Not much, only enough that anyone looking closely would see it. The line between her brows, the corners of her mouth pulled down just slightly, as if her body had grown so used to bracing for pain that even when no one was hitting her, the muscles of her face still held the posture of defense. Phoebe watched Nell sleep for a long time. Then she gently slipped her hand away from Nell's elbow, stood up, crossed the aisle, and sat in the empty seat beside her father in row 23. Asher looked at his daughter. Phoebe's eyes were red but dry, the kind of red that belongs to someone who finished crying a long time ago and now has only something harder than tears left behind. "Dad," she said, her voice low, leaning close to Asher's ear so no one else could hear. "I need to tell you about Miss Nell." Asher didn't say anything. He only tilted his head slightly toward his daughter, the way he always listened, not with words but with complete silence. Phoebe began to speak. 6 months. That was how long Nell Fleming had tutored Phoebe at the Kane townhouse on the Upper East Side. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, from 7 to 9, literature and creative writing. Nell wasn't the usual kind of tutor hired by Asher's staff. She didn't force Phoebe to study, didn't assign homework, didn't grade anything. She read books. She sat in the armchair beside Phoebe's bed and read, sometimes novels, sometimes poetry, sometimes just children's books. Phoebe should have been too old for by then, but she never interrupted, because the way Nell read wasn't like anyone Phoebe had ever known. She read as if every word mattered, as if the story wasn't something lying on paper, but something truly happening right there in the room. "She was the only one," Phoebe said, her voice cracking slightly on the last word before hardening again at once. "The only one since Mom died that I wanted to sit beside for more than 2 hours." Asher felt something strike him square in the chest, but his face didn't change. "And then she disappeared," Phoebe went on. "One Tuesday night, she didn't come. The house manager called. No answer. Called again the next day, and the phone number had been disconnected. No email. No text. Nothing at all." She paused and swallowed, except for one message. "She sent it to me from an unknown number at 2 a.m, the day she disappeared." Phoebe opened her phone, scrolled through hundreds of messages, and stopped at one she had saved 6 months earlier. She held the screen out to her father. Asher read it. "I'm sorry. I can't explain. Don't look for me. Don't ever stop reading. You're far more gifted than you think." Asher read the message twice, then handed the phone back to his daughter. "Do you know why she had to leave?" he asked. Phoebe nodded, slowly. I searched online, looked up her name, Nell Fleming. There wasn't much, but I found a marriage record in the state of Pennsylvania. She married a man named Drew Shelton 3 years ago. She paused for a beat, then continued, each word clear, as if she had practiced this sentence in her mind many times. I think he found out she was tutoring me, and I think he didn't allow it, and I think he hurt her because of it. 15 years old. His daughter was 15 years old, and sitting on a plane explaining domestic abuse to him in a voice so calm, it was frightening. Asher didn't ask another question. He stared straight ahead at the back of the seat in row 22, where someone had wedged a soft travel pillow into the gap. And in that moment, he wasn't on the plane anymore. He was standing on the staircase in the old house in Flatbush, Brooklyn, 12 years old, barefoot on the cold wooden floor, looking down into the kitchen through the banister rails. His mother was down there, on her knees on the kitchen floor, his father standing over her, his hand still clenched after the punch Asher had heard but arrived 1 second too late to see. His mother looked up, not at his father, up at the staircase, straight into Asher's eyes through the banister, and she said, her voice so steady it was almost absurd for a woman who had just been hit to her knees, "Don't come down. Don't ever become him." His mother died 2 years later, cancer, according to the hospital records. But Asher knew a hospital can only write down the final cause. It can't write down the 10 years before it, the sleepless nights, the meals she couldn't swallow, the times her body was thrown into a wall and then had to rise again and make breakfast as if nothing had happened. A hospital can't record those things, but the body remembers, and his mother's body had remembered every one of them until the day it couldn't bear them anymore. Asher came back to the present. His eyes dropped to his hands. Both of them were gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles had gone white, and the veins were standing out beneath his skin. He didn't remember when he had started squeezing. Phoebe looked at her father's hands. She knew that expression. It wasn't ordinary anger. It was something older, deeper, something she had never asked about because the instinct of a child raised beside Asher Kane had taught her that there were doors inside her father that no one should open. "Dad," Phoebe said softly. Asher slowly opened his hands, one finger at a time, as if he were peeling strands of steel wire off the armrests. He turned and looked at his daughter. His eyes had gone back to normal, cold, measured, controlled. But somewhere very deep behind that glass, Phoebe saw something she had seen only once before, the night her mother died in the hospital, and Asher sat by her bed holding his wife's hand for 4 hours without saying a word. "What's his name?" Asher asked. "Drew Shelton," Phoebe answered. Asher nodded once, only once. Then he looked across the aisle to row 24, where Nell Fleming was still asleep with her face drawn tight and the gray scarf hiding the finger-shaped bruise on her neck. And in Asher Kane's mind, beside the names Ray Holt and Pinnacle Freight LLC, there was now one more name, Drew Shelton. And the list of people who would have to pay when this plane landed had just grown by one line. The plane touched down on the LAX runway at 3:17 in the afternoon local time. The wheels struck the tarmac with that familiar vibration running through the cabin floor, the kind of shudder frequent flyers no longer notice but first-time passengers grip the armrests through. Nell woke at that exact moment. Her eyes opened with the speed of someone who never truly sleeps deeply, the kind of instant waking that doesn't need a few seconds to remember where she is, because people used to being awakened by pain always know where they are right away. Phoebe had already moved back to the seat beside Nell before the plane began its descent. She held Nell's hand while the aircraft taxied to the gate, saying nothing, only holding on, and Nell let her. Los Angeles, in the October afternoon, was 10 degrees hotter than New York, and the sunlight was different too. Not that sharp light cutting through the glass at JFK, but a flat white glare that covered everything in brightness so intense, it made people squint the moment they stepped out of the jet bridge. Asher walked into the arrivals hall 3 steps ahead of Phoebe and Nell. Habit. Always enter the room first. Always scan the space, before letting the people he protects walk into it. And his eyes found what he needed in less than 5 seconds. Ray Holt, standing beside a concrete pillar wrapped in a rental car advertisement near the entrance to baggage claim. 52 years old, silver hair combed back with gel, dark blue suit, silver tie clip, polished leather shoes reflecting the fluorescent lights. Everything on him said, "I matter in the language. Only people who don't truly matter ever need to use." Holt was watching each passenger coming out of the gate. His eyes moved quickly, methodically, searching for someone specific. The inspector. The man Holt had ordered Mercer to keep off the plane at JFK. The man who shouldn't have been on this flight at all. Holt didn't know what that inspector looked like. He only knew there was an inspector. And when Asher Kane passed within less than 2 meters of him, in a faded black hoodie with his daughter's backpack slung over one shoulder, Holt looked straight through him as though he were air. His gaze slid off Asher and onto the person behind him and kept scanning. Asher didn't slow his step, didn't look back, but he noted everything. The face, the position, the direction of Holt's eyes, the way he held his phone in his left hand and checked it every 30 seconds. The way a man holds a phone when he's waiting for a confirmation message that never comes. They passed through baggage claim and into the waiting area when Nell's phone buzzed. Not rang, buzzed. Buzzed over and over, relentless. The way it does when the person on the other end doesn't call once and wait, but calls, hangs up, calls again, hangs up, calls again. With the mechanical obsession of a controlling man who can't accept being ignored. Nell pulled out her phone. The screen lit up. 14 missed calls. All from the same number. All within the 5 hours since the plane had taken off and her phone had lost signal. 14 times. Nell's hand began to shake. Not a slight tremor. It shook from her fingers into her wrist and up her arm. The kind of shaking that happens when the body recognizes danger before the mind has time to process it. The kind of shaking Asher had seen in his mother's hands every night when she heard the key in the lock and knew his father was home. Nell turned off the screen, stuffed the phone into her coat pocket, but the phone buzzed again. The 15th call. Phoebe looked at Nell, looked at her trembling hands, looked at the way Nell tried to shove the phone deeper into the pocket, as if fabric could bury it. Then Phoebe turned to her father with the eyes Asher knew well, eyes that didn't say "I'm scared," but said, "Do something." Asher stepped beside Nell. For the first time since boarding the plane, he stood close enough for her to see his face clearly. And for the first time, he spoke directly to her. "The man calling you," Asher said, his voice low, even, not a ripple of emotion on the surface. "How dangerous is he?" Nell looked up at him. Her eyes met Asher's. And in that moment something passed between them that no words could translate. She saw something in this man's eyes, something that should have frightened her 1,000 times more than Drew ever could. And yet somehow it wasn't pointed at her. It was like looking into the barrel of a gun and knowing with complete certainty that the muzzle wasn't aimed at you. "He'll find me," Nell said. Her voice didn't shake the way her hands did. Her voice was flat in the way of someone who has accepted a truth for so long it has become a constant. "No matter where I go, he'll find me." "No." One word. Asher spoke only one word, soft enough that only Nell could hear it, but with enough weight to fill the whole airport hall. It wasn't a promise. Promises are what people make when they aren't yet sure they can deliver. This was something else. A declaration. A fact being spoken before it happened. Nell looked at him for 2 more seconds. Then she nodded. Once. Slightly. As if she didn't fully believe him, but was too tired not to. Asher slipped his hand into the inner pocket of his hoodie and touched the cold silver watch, pulled it out, and opened it. The small click sounded in the noise of the LAX arrivals hall. He looked at the face, the FK, engraved on the lid, catching the airport light. And in his mind, Faye's voice rose from a memory he hadn't called for, but that came on its own. Her voice from the last afternoon before the hospital no longer let her speak. "Real power isn't making people afraid, Asher. It's making people safe." The first time she said that, in the hospital, Asher hadn't understood. He was a man who had built an empire on fear, by making sure every enemy knew the price of crossing him. Safety wasn't a language he spoke, but now, standing in LAX with his daughter beside him and a trembling woman in front of him, those words carried a different weight for the first time. They weren't just a memory anymore. They were a compass. He snapped the watch shut, slipped it back into his pocket, took out his phone and called Jonah. 1 ring. Talk. 3 things, Asher said. First, the board meeting tomorrow. Holt called it without my authorization. Get corporate counsel and shut it down before 8 in the morning. The paperwork has to reach the board secretary before Holt gets a chance to open his mouth. Done. Second, Dr. Keith Dunn, independent auditor. Call him right now. I want an emergency audit of Pinnacle Freight LLC. 18 months of transactions, traced all the way back. He gets full access to Atlantic Crown's financial system starting now. I'm authorizing it. Understood. Third, Asher lowered his voice another degree. Drew Shelton. Find me everything. Who he is, where he is, what he does, who he works for, who he owes, who he fears. Everything. Before midnight. There was a brief silence on the other end. Jonah Webb had worked for Asher for 6 years, and in those 6 years he had heard every kind of request at every kind of hour. But these 3 tasks, that last name, the way Asher said it, this wasn't the voice he used for business. It was another voice, the one Jonah had only ever heard when someone had touched something Asher Kane considered his. Before midnight, Jonah said. Asher ended the call, looked over at Phoebe standing beside Nell, her hand resting gently on Nell's back in a way no 15-year-old should have to know. But Phoebe knew because she had once stood beside her mother's hospital bed and learned how to touch someone who was hurting without hurting them more. Come on, Asher said to both of them. I know a place. He led them toward the exit, past the concrete pillar where Ray Holt was still standing and scanning for the inspector. And for the second time that day, Asher Kane walked past the man betraying him, without that man realizing it. But this time, Asher looked. One brief glance, quick, less than a second. Enough to burn forever into memory the face of the man using his money to steal his company. Then he stepped through the automatic doors into the Los Angeles afternoon sunlight, where his daughter was leading a woman by the hand, a woman he had just decided no one would ever touch again, whether that person was Drew Shelton or anyone else left on this earth. The taxi moved along Lincoln Boulevard toward the ocean, past rows of surf shops and cafes with tables spilling onto the sidewalk, past graffiti-covered walls that Los Angeles called art, and the rest of America called vandalism, past tall palms standing on either side of the road like an honor guard for a city that never stopped performing. Asher sat in the front seat beside the driver. Nell and Phoebe sat in the back. No one spoke for 20 minutes. Venice Beach in the October afternoon was still crowded, but not with the kind of crowd summer brought. Joggers had taken the place of sunbathers. People walking dogs had replaced the ice cream vendors, and the sunlight was softer now, more slanted, washing everything in that warm golden color only October on the West Coast seems to know how to make. Asher told the driver to stop in a narrow alley 2 blocks from the beach. At the end of the alley stood a 2-story motel painted ivory white, the paint peeling near the bottom of the walls, with a red Spanish tile roof, worn oak stairs leading to the 2nd floor, and a small hand-painted sign in faded blue hanging above the front door. Romano's, vacancies. Agnes Romano was sitting at the front desk, which was really just an old kitchen table pushed against the entrance, with a yellowing pot of basil on top of it, a thick leather ledger, and a cup of espresso gone cold. 72 years old, silver hair pinned up high, her back still straight in the way only Neapolitan Italian women seem able to keep at that age, as if their spines had been cast from something harder than bone. She looked up when the bell over the door rang, looked at Asher, looked at the hoodie, looked past Asher and saw Phoebe and Nell standing behind him, then looked back at Asher, and her eyes changed. Not suddenly, slowly, the way ink spreads through paper, from curiosity to recognition, to something caught between surprise and an old sorrow. Asher Kane, she said. Not a question, a fact. Her voice carried the warm, rough edge of someone who had smoked in the past and still drank wine in the present. Her English threaded with an Italian accent that 50 years in America still hadn't managed to wash away. It's been a long time. It has, Agnes. Since her. She didn't say the name. She didn't need to. Asher nodded. Agnes looked at him for one more second, then turned to Phoebe. Good Lord. That girl is her mother all over again. The eyes, the nose, even the way she stands with one hand on her hip. Phoebe had no idea who Agnes was, but the instinct that came with being Asher Kane's daughter told her that anyone her father trusted enough to bring them to, without calling ahead, was someone safe. Asher didn't explain much. I need a room. Quiet. No name in the ledger. Agnes didn't ask why. She had lived in Venice Beach long enough to know there were questions whose answers wouldn't change what she was about to do. She pulled a brass key from the desk drawer and laid it on the table beside the basil. Room 4. 2nd floor, end of the hall, window facing the courtyard. Then she looked at Nell, looked at the scarf wrapped tightly around her neck even though the weather was 90 degrees, looked at the swollen eyes, looked at the way she stood slightly behind Phoebe, as if she were using a 15-year-old girl as a shield between herself and the rest of the world. Agnes didn't say anything to Nell. She simply turned into the kitchen behind the desk and came back carrying a glass of water and a neatly folded clean washcloth, then placed both into Nell's hands without asking a single question. Nell looked down at the water and the cloth, then looked up at Agnes. Her lips moved. "Thank you." "There's nothing to thank me for," Agnes said. "Go wash your face, sweetheart. Dried tears make the skin itch." Room 4 was at the end of the second-floor hall. Small, but clean. The kind of clean that doesn't come from hotel chemicals, but from hands that scrub and know every corner of the wall. One double bed with spotless white sheets, a small wooden table against the wall, a ceiling fan turning slowly with a steady clicking sound that, if you listened long enough, would become the sleepiest sound in the world. And the window, just as Agnes had said, looked out over the courtyard, where a large fig tree spread its branches wide enough to cover nearly half the yard, its dark green leaves glimmering in the late sunlight filtering through the narrow gap between the buildings. Asher looked at the fig tree, and memory came without invitation. 16 years earlier, this same room, this same bed, Faye lying curled on the pillow, hair loose, bare feet, smiling with her whole eyes, while Asher stood at the window, looking out into the courtyard with the skepticism of a man who had just spent enough money to book a presidential suite at the Ritz-Carlton and was now standing in a motel with no bar. "I chose this place," Faye had said, her voice carrying that laugh he had never once been able to refuse. "Anywhere with the ocean and pasta is heaven. You don't need a rooftop to see the sky. You just need to step outside." It had been their honeymoon. Not Paris, not the Maldives, Venice Beach. In the motel of an old Italian woman, because Faye Kane, the only woman on earth bold enough to tell Asher Kane that his money was sometimes really stupid, had wanted to stay here, and Asher, the man who could make the East Coast kneel, had stayed here. For her, 16 years later, Asher stood in that same doorway, looking at that same fig tree, but Faye was no longer lying on the bed. In her place was Nell Fleming, setting her old backpack down on the edge of the bed with the care of someone used to living inside spaces that didn't belong to her. She pulled open the zipper to take out the bottle of water Agnes had given her, and when she drew it free, the zipper tugged everything else inside the bag out of place. And once again, the book fell. The giving tree slipped from the mouth of the backpack, turned once in the air, and landed on the wooden floor of room 4 with a soft sound that echoed through the quiet room. The second time that day, the book had fallen out. The second time that day, it lay on the floor in the short distance between people who still didn't know what to say to each other. Phoebe crouched on the floor and picked it up, but this time she didn't hand it back to Nell. She held it against her chest instead, both arms wrapped tightly around the torn hardback as if it were the last thing still tying her to those 6 months of being read to every evening. 6 months of having someone sit beside her bed and give her something that none of the things her father owned could ever buy. Nell watched Phoebe holding the book. She lifted a hand to cover her eyes, but she didn't cry. Or maybe she was crying and had simply become too skilled at doing it without making a sound. Asher stood in the doorway of room 4. He looked at his daughter sitting on the floor holding a children's book, looked at the woman on the bed covering her eyes, looked at the fig tree outside the window that Faye had once called the most beautiful tree she had seen in California. And somewhere deep inside Asher Kane's chest, behind his ribs, behind the steel casing that 20 years in the underworld had welded shut, something cracked, only slightly, almost too little to notice, but enough that he had to lift a hand to his chest, touch the place where his heart was beating, and remain still in that doorway for 3 more seconds before stepping out into the hall and closing the door behind him. Asher rented room 3, right beside room 4, paid in cash, no name, the way he did everything when he didn't want the world to know where he was. Room 3 was smaller than room 4, just a bed, a wooden desk, a table lamp with a fabric shade gone yellow with age, and a window facing the brick wall of the building next door instead of the courtyard with the fig tree. Asher didn't need the fig tree. He needed a desk and a strong Wi-Fi signal. By 9 o'clock that night, Phoebe was asleep in room 4, curled on one side of the bed with the giving tree still resting against her chest. Nell lay on the other side, eyes closed, though Asher wasn't sure she was sleeping. He closed the door to room 4 as gently as if he were closing the lid of a music box, stepped into room 3, locked the door, sat down at the wooden desk, and began to work. Jonah had sent everything: the operating account of the Los Angeles Center, the transaction records for 18 months, the Delaware registration file for Pinnacle Freight LLC, and a tracing chain Jonah had spent 4 hours pulling out of the banking system through someone he knew in compliance, someone whose name Asher didn't ask for and didn't want to know. Asher read every line on the phone screen, the blue light reflecting across his face in the dark room, turning his features into something carved from stone instead of flesh. The money moved like this. From Atlantic Crown's Los Angeles operating account, 8 transfers in 18 months, each one between $400,000 and $650,000. Total, $4,200,000. Everyone marked as maintenance services and ground logistics. Everyone paid to Pinnacle Freight LLC. From Pinnacle Freight, the money moved into an intermediary account at a small bank in Wilmington, Delaware. The account held under another company, Coastal Ridge Consulting, which also had no office, no employees, no real business activity. From Coastal Ridge, the money left the United States and went to an account in the Cayman Islands belonging to the investment fund Meridian Partners, the exact name Jonah had said Holt was using to buy 35% of Atlantic Crown's shares in tomorrow morning's board meeting. A perfect circle. Money left Atlantic Crown, passed through 2 shell layers, then came back to buy Atlantic Crown itself. Holt was using Asher's money to steal Asher's company, and if tomorrow's meeting went according to plan, the whole thing would be legalized before anyone had the chance to look back. Asher set the phone down on the desk, looked at the brick wall outside the window, calculated. Holt needed that meeting. Without the meeting, the circle couldn't close. If it didn't close, the money stayed trapped in Cayman. Meridian Partners remained nothing but an empty shell holding dirty money, and there was no legal leverage to touch Atlantic Crown's shares. The meeting was the weakest link, and Asher had already told Jonah to break it before 8 in the morning. The phone vibrated. New message from Jonah, not about Holt, about the other name, Drew Shelton, 33 years old, born in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Former Marine, served 4 years, discharged early with a record stating serious disciplinary violations. The military's polite language for saying he had beaten enough people that they didn't want to keep him. After discharge, Shelton worked as bar security for 14 months, then got fired for assaulting a customer. After that, he disappeared from the formal labor system for 2 years. Then he resurfaced as security for Marcus Keene, a mid-level drug dealer operating in the Kensington area of Philadelphia. Asher knew Marcus Keene. Not knew him in the sense of shaking hands and exchanging greetings. Knew him in the sense that Keene owed the Kane organization $2,300,000 for product from 14 months earlier and had asked for extensions 4 times. And each time Asher had allowed it because Keene was small enough not to be worth the trouble and scared enough not to run. Drew Shelton worked for Marcus Keene. Marcus Keene owed Asher Kane. The connection was so simple, it was almost funny, if its context hadn't been the bruises on the neck of a woman sleeping in the next room. Asher closed the message, looked at the clock on his phone, 1:47 in the morning. He had been sitting at that desk for nearly 5 hours. His neck was stiff, his eyes dry from the screen light, but his mind was sharper than it had been all day. He stood up, opened the door to room 3, and stepped into the hall intending to go downstairs for a bottle of water because Agnes always kept a case of mineral water by the front desk for guests during the night. But he didn't make it downstairs, because at the end of the hall, on the wooden stairway leading to the first floor, Nell was sitting there, alone, her legs drawn up on the step, both arms wrapped around her knees, her face turned toward the darkness below where the Venice Beach alley lay still, beneath the dull yellow streetlights. She wasn't crying, wasn't trembling. She was just sitting there, motionless, like someone who had forgotten how to move, or no longer had a reason to move anywhere at all. Asher stopped. His first instinct was to turn back into his room. His second instinct, deeper, older, the instinct he had thought he buried with Faye, told him to walk forward. So he did. He didn't speak. He sat down on the step about an arm's length from Nell, leaned back against the wooden railing, and looked out at the same darkness she was looking at. The silence stretched on, not the kind that needed to be filled, the kind they both needed. Nell spoke first. "I don't know who you are." Her voice was small. She didn't look at him. She kept staring into the alley. "I don't know what you do. I don't know why you're helping me. But Phoebe trusts you. And I trust Phoebe." Asher didn't answer right away. He listened to the sound of the ocean drifting in from 2 blocks away. Soft, steady, the kind of sound Los Angeles throws around for free, while in other places people pay resort prices just to hear it. "You don't need to know who I am," Asher said at last. His voice was low, not gentle in the comforting sense. Low in the way the ground beneath your feet is low, the way something solid and unmoving is. "You only need to know one thing. No one touches you again. Nell turned and looked at him, for the first time in the dark, with no Phoebe between them, with no noisy airport hall around them, just two people on the stairway of a cheap motel in Venice Beach, at 2 a.m. She looked into his eyes and searched for what she had searched for in every man's eyes since marrying Drew, the sign of danger, the seed of control, the familiar shadow of someone who would use today's kindness as tomorrow's chain. She didn't find it. Not because Asher Kane wasn't dangerous. He was more dangerous than any man she had ever met in her life, and somewhere deep in instinct, Nell knew that. But his danger wasn't pointed at her. It was there, plainly, like fire in a hearth, hot enough to burn anyone, but warming only the people sitting on the right side of it. Why? She asked. One word, the way he had said no at the airport that afternoon. Asher looked out into the alley, thought of his mother, thought of Faye. Thought of Phoebe holding that torn hardback on the floor of room 4. Because someone should have said that to my mother 30 years ago, he said, and no one did. Nell didn't ask another question. She turned back toward the alley. The silence continued, but this time it was different. No longer heavy, thinner now. Lighter, like a thread that had just been drawn between two people out of the dark, and neither of them yet knew how much weight it would be strong enough to hold. But it was there, real and fragile. Asher sat there for 5 more minutes, then stood up, went downstairs for a bottle of water, came back up and set it beside Nell on the stair without saying a word. Then he walked into room 3, closed the door, and for the first time in many years, Asher Kane lay down on a bed with a name in his mind that wasn't the name of an enemy. It was the name of the person he had just promised to protect, even though she had no idea that a promise from Asher Kane wasn't the kind people make and then forget. It was the kind of promise someone would have to pay for if it was ever broken, and the person paying would never be her. Asher had barely closed the door to room 3 for even 2 minutes when his phone vibrated. Jonah. Not a text this time. A call. Jonah Webb didn't call at 2 a.m. unless what he needed to say shouldn't exist in writing. Asher answered. Shelton knows which flight she took, Jonah said, his voice moving half a beat faster than usual. Enough for Asher to know this wasn't a routine update. He didn't even bother with customer service. Our logs show a direct, unauthorized query from an internal terminal. Pratt, or one of his associates, bypassed the privacy filters and handed Shelton the full passenger list, including Nell's seat and destination, before the plane even left the tarmac. Who? I'm tracing it. Faster. I'm going as fast as I can. But Asher, here's the problem. Shelton knows she came to LA, and he's in Philadelphia, 5 hours from LA by air. If he booked the second he got the information, the earliest flight lands at LAX at 6 a.m. 4 hours. Asher said nothing for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was the longest Jonah had ever had to wait for an answer from him. I'll handle it, Asher said, then hung up. He didn't go back to bed, didn't sit at the desk. He took his room key, stepped into the hall, past the stair where Nell had been sitting but which was empty now. The bottle of water he had left beside her gone too, which meant she had gone back to the room. Good. He went downstairs, past the dark reception desk where Agnes had turned off the lights long ago, and out into the motel's back courtyard. The courtyard was small, paved in old red tile, with an iron table and 2 chairs that Agnes used during the day to drink espresso and talk on the phone with her sister in Napoli. At night, it was empty and quiet, with only the wind from the ocean slipping through the wall gaps, carrying the smell of salt and wet seaweed that always belonged to Venice Beach after 10 at night. Asher stood in the middle of the courtyard, pulled out his phone, scrolled through his contacts to a name he didn't call often. Not because he didn't trust him, because every time he called, it meant someone was about to have a problem, and Asher wasn't a man who wasted problems on things that didn't deserve them. Tonight deserved them. He pressed call. 2 rings. You're calling me at 2 a.m. The voice on the other end said, deep, slow, not sleepy. The voice of a man who didn't sleep at normal hours. The last time you called me at this hour was in 2017.